So we're going to be looking at what's going on at home during the early Cold War. And we need to start by looking at labor unions. Now, I've told you sort of the trials and tribulations of labor unions going all the way back to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was famously used against labor unions at Pullman. And then we saw the Clayton Antitrust Act, which actually helped unions out in the Progressive era. Then we saw that unions gained strength in World War I, only to really lose it in the 1920s. Only to gain it back with Section 7A of the NIRA, only to lose it in Schechter, only to gain it back in the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, and to get power in World War II. But really by 1947 is when it all goes away in something known as Taft-Hartley. What's important to know that coming out of World War II, labor was as powerful as ever. With almost 15 million workers, more than half of the entire workforce was unionized. And most of these labor unions had traditionally voted Democrat. However, in the elections of 1946, it didn't go that way, and Republicans got control of Congress, both the House and the Senate, for the first time since back when Herbert Hoover was elected in 1928. And the Republican Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act required union leaders to take a loyalty oath declaring that they were not members of the Communist Party. It also basically made it so that employers could openly campaign against efforts of their workers to form unions, and it also outlawed unions from coercing their workers to join unions. So at the end of the day, it really struck at labor's power because it banned strikes by federal employees. It imposed a cooling off period of 80 days on any strike that the president deemed too dangerous to the public welfare. What you have to understand is labor would never recover after 1947. It is going to be a very sad state of labor affairs ever since truly sort of the beginning of the Cold War. Now, to labor unions, the most troubling element of this bill was a provision that allowed state congresses to pass what are known as right-to-work laws, which end the practice of forcing workers at a company to join a union once a majority voted to unionize. So it would be like if more than 50% of the teachers here voted to unionize, then everybody would have to be part of a union. Made it so that's not the case. In a show of support for organized labor, Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley. Okay, at that point, in theory, it could have been dead, but in the end, Congress overturned the president's veto, which is tough to do because you need 2/3 of both the House and the Senate, but being Republican controlled, they were able to do that. The number of strikes dropped shortly thereafter, and representatives of the management learned to sort of, not have to negotiate with labor after that. So within about 10 years, or 7 years, I guess, by 1954, 15 state legislatures, mainly in the West and the South, which have been the most unfavorable to labor, had used the Taft-Hartley Act to pass these right-to-work laws forbidding what we call union-only workplaces, which was, again, that whole goal of Samuel Gompers going all the way back to the AFL. Now, going back actually before the war, there had been a group called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, so again, in the House of Representatives. And for a long time, they had been looking into what they thought were communist agents in the federal government. In the same year, 1947, that Taft-Hartley was passed, Truman signed an executive order, aka a loyalty order, requiring federal government workers to undergo a background investigation to ensure that they were not communists or even associated with communists. Truman knew that this loyalty oath program violated civil liberties, but he felt like he had no choice, that he was responding to pressure from the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and the Attorney General, who were convinced that there were numerous spies working inside the federal government. Truman was also eager to deal with criticism that he was not doing enough to ensure that the Soviet sympathizers were working in our government. What's interesting to note is, this is 1947. 1949 is when we, quote, lose China to communism, and he's particularly tarred as being somebody who's soft on communism. So think about what he was doing before the accusations really came. Now, HUAC actually went after Hollywood, but there had been a long-time belief that Hollywood, not just the federal government, was a hotbed of communism, and there was a full-blown investigation into the motion picture industry. And HUAC subpoenaed dozens of actors, producers, and directors to testify at these famous hearings. 10 witnesses, famously known as the Hollywood 10, absolutely refused to testify, saying, listen, this is against our First Amendment rights. All 10 who refused to testify were cited for contempt, they were given prison terms, and the important term is they were blacklisted. We've seen this as something that management has been able to do to union leaders in the past, basically say, you're not going to work at this company, and I'm going to tell all my friends who run the other companies that you can't get a job either. So that was a famous instance of blacklisting with the Hollywood 10. Now, we also need to look into this idea of what happens once the Russians develop a bomb, and there's going to be this sort of mad paranoia, or I should say massive paranoia or mad dash to figure out how the Soviets got the bomb faster than we thought they would. So in 1950, a year after the 1949 detonation of the bomb, the FBI enters a spy network that involves both Americans and British communists who had, in fact, passed information about the development of our bomb to the Soviets. Famously, there's a man named Klaus Fuchs, who's a German-born English nuclear physicist who'd worked in the United States during the war and helped develop the atomic bomb. Now, we remember that name less than the people that he were also in the spy ring with, a New York couple, former communists, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now, they claimed that they were innocent, but Ethel's brother-in-law, David, actually said, no, I was in the spy ring, and so was my sister and her husband, okay? And the convictions of Fuchs and the Rosenbergs fueled this Republican charge, again, now we're after China has fallen, that Truman's administration is not doing enough to hunt down communist agents and to really, guarantee the freedom of the free world. Now, the Rosenberg case was called by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, the crime of the century. And it heightened this paranoia in the United States that there was a large-ranging Soviet network of spies that had given Stalin the secret of building the atomic weapons. The Rosenbergs are found guilty and sentenced to death, and they're the first Americans executed for spying. Now, all of this sort of pales in comparison, and I hate to say that because obviously the Rosenbergs were executed, but to sort of the wide-ranging accusations of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. Now, early in 1950, again, after China has fallen to communism, after the detonation of the first Soviet bomb, a little-known Republican Senator McCarthy arrived on the scene as the most ruthless manipulator of anti-communist anxieties. And again, trying to get attention for this anti-communism cause, he gave a famous speech at the Women's Republican Club in Wheeling, West Virginia. And he claimed that the State Department, again, our State Department is the executive department that deals with foreign policy, was infested with communists. He claimed to have a list of 205 names in the State Department, although he never provided them. And again, he never provided a single shred of evidence for pretty much any accusation he made. And over the next 4 years, McCarthy would make more and more wild accusations. Initially, many of them against Democrats, who he smeared as dupes or fellow travelers of the commies. And now McCarthy enjoyed the backing of his fellow Republicans because in the 1950 congressional election, they were hoping that they could sort of use that to get elected. But by the next summer, after those elections, he'd gotten totally out of control. Sort of his almost most famous accusation was accusing George Marshall, the former Secretary of State, he of the Marshall Plan. He'd also been a war hero. They accused him of basically being allied with Stalin, okay? And it was like, he's going to have even more, and we'll talk about that when he sort of fully flames out. But concerns about the truth didn't really faze McCarthy. His focus was really on drawing as much attention to himself. It didn't matter if these were groundless accusations. Never did he once uncover a single communist agent, but his whole effort destroyed lives and reputations, many of whom basically, all these lies went unchallenged until the end of the Korean War. And thousands of left-wing Americans were blacklisted from employment. Again, we only talk about the sort of famous Hollywood 10, but because of these, real or rumored past political associations, okay? So during this era of McCarthyism, actually in 1952, and it sounds almost similar, you've got McCarthyism, and then you've got what's known as the McCarran Internal Security Act. This was passed by Congress over Truman's veto. The law made it unlawful to combine or conspire in any way with any person or to perform any act which would substantially contribute to the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship. So basically saying you can't sort of plan to have sort of a communist takeover, okay? Now, communist organizations had to actually register with the Attorney General. And people that were coming in from other countries, from places where they'd been part of governments that might be totalitarian, were actually barred from entry. And then they went even further and said, if there's any national emergency, like a war, American communists could be held in concentration camps. So again, sort of explicitly anti-communist laws, much of like what we'd seen sort of in terms of like the 1921 and 24 Immigration Acts, although those weren't as explicitly communist. Now, you're going to see, certainly the fears of communism and spies are going to turn into this paranoia. And it's also going to turn into some real strong anti-Semitism, because many of the communists were from Eastern Europe. Many of the Eastern Europeans that were coming in were Jews. And in fact, many of the communist sympathizers were in fact Jewish. But the Red Scare also provided this really powerful tool to claim that Democrats were soft on communism, which we saw certainly with Truman. But overall, one of the most painful and dangerous effects of the Red Scare was to sort of encourage this widespread conformity of thought and culture. And by 1950, it was dangerous to criticize anything associated with the American way of life. And we're going to talk about that really once we get into something called the Beat Generation and these sort of iconoclastic artists who are going to really criticize, much like we saw with the Lost Generation during the 1920s. Now, one of those major changes, both sort of in terms of government and the economy, came with the enlarged interstate highway system, which was funded largely by federal gasoline taxes. It took a quarter century to build and was the largest federal project in U.S. history. It created, a system of almost 50,000 miles, had over 50,000 bridges, and highway construction generated what economists would call this multiplier effect, because much like the car had earlier on, with glass and paint and steel, even in real estate. Here, this huge interstate highway system is going to create jobs. It's going to spread tourism. It's going to spread like motels, billboards, fast food, long-haul trucking industries. And in many ways, it actually transforms the way people travel. In many ways, it is really the end of railroads now that we really have long-haul trucking that's going to become so popular, okay? And as well, it's going to really sort of create this whole sort of idea of the family vacation by car. And if you need to see a great movie about that, please see Vacation and the trip to Wally World back from the 80s. Now, we're going to talk real quick before we start the next lecture about the end of McCarthyism and how he just fully flamed out, okay? Now, Eisenhower, this kindly, grandfatherly president, despised McCarthy. But he refused to criticize him in public, famously saying he didn't want to get into a pissing contest with that skunk. But McCarthy actually sort of committed his own political suicide when he made the absurd charge that the U.S. Army was soft on communism. He'd already accused George Marshall. Now he's going to go after the whole Army. And he does this over a month in the spring of 1954, and actually these televised Army McCarthy hearings that 80 million viewers got to watch every night. And McCarthy was at his worst, hounding witnesses, seeking publicity, producing no evidence, basically, looking like a bore. Finally, in the end, the Army's legal counsel, Joseph Welch, sort of said, like, have you no decency, sir? Sort of clearly just showed how out of line he was. And in the end, the Senate actually voted almost 2/3, 1/3 to condemn McCarthy. Now, that didn't mean he was kicked out. It just is sort of a public censure. But his crusade against communism really put him in the limelight out of nowhere and captured the nation's attention. But in the process, when many people wouldn't stop him, he trampled so many civil liberties. And then, in the end, with sort of this unexpected suddenness, his crusade is over. And so after the flame out in the Army McCarthy hearings, he's dead. He dies of liver inflammation brought on by alcohol abuse. And so it was a quick rise and just a quick fall for Joseph McCarthy and the idea of McCarthyism.